Welcome to the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burruss. And today we have our guest is Dr. Julian Hayter. He's a historian whose research focuses on modern U.S. history, American political development, African American history, and the civil rights movement. He's the author of the acclaimed book, The Dream is Lost, Voting Rights in the Political Race in Richmond, Virginia. His work has been published in the Journal of Policy History and Richmond Journal of Law and Public Interest. He also contributes to national and local media outlets. He teaches in the Gibson School at the University of Richmond, courses such as leadership, humanities, justice, and civil society, and Reimagine Richmond and the city's contribution to the freedom struggle. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
So let's get started with some of these questions on, and our topic is, by the way, critical race theory. It's getting a lot of media lately, so we want to get to the bottom of what is critical race theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's old. It's about as old as I am, and I'm 46. So it's interesting that we're having a discussion about critical race theory in 2021, given in academic years, it's ancient, by the way, by comparison. It was formulated in the 1970s. It actually emerges out of critical legal studies, which comes out of Harvard Law School. And the argument is in its extension of critical legal studies is that American law is not objective and it's not apolitical, that culture influences law. And critical race theory is an extension of that belief in that the argument is very basically, in the Cliff Notes version, that race has had a profound influence on the American legal system. It's a graduate school theory, in essence. And it's created by a number of people, namely Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. And they carry it into the 1980s. And the argument ultimately is that racism is not, in relationship to law, an individual act of malice per se, as much as it's been institutionalized into the American legal system, since there's been an American legal system. And it is impossible to understand American political development without race, in large part because of the defining characteristic of who we are.
Could you tie that into, say, the Bacon Rebellion and the Black Codes back in the 1600s?
Well, yeah, right? I mean, the codification of race laws began in Virginia, right? What we know of race as a legal construct, as being bound, as slaves being bound for life to bondage, actually is from the Commonwealth of Virginia. So a critical race theorist would say it's impossible to separate the American legal system from the slave codes that emerged in Virginia in the 17th century.
Oh, and it's interesting you say the law follows the culture.
Right. Yeah. So, and more importantly, the law follows an economic culture, right? Because bondage emerged in colonial Virginia as tobacco production increased. So there's an inextricable link between the viability of tobacco production. I mean, they were moving millions of pounds of tobacco, right, by the Revolutionary out of Virginia. And as tobacco production became more viable, Virginia became a slave society, the laws follow the economic culture.
To keep them enslaved.
That's right.
Okay, explain the current racial crisis and the reemergence for white or Caucasian supremacy.
Well, we'd be here all day, right?
Okay. We don't have all day.
It's hard to say, right? I mean, I think that many white Americans, particularly the boomer generation, were raised to believe that that upward mobility was a birthright, right? That simply being born in the United States in the late 20th century meant that you would be better off than your parents. And there have been global and international and national economic forces that belie these trends. So I think there's a kind of collective sense of anxiety in the United States because of economic forces beyond, in many instances, the United States control, where people are feeling more vulnerable than they would have otherwise. And I think we've seen a reemergence of white supremacy, in large part, out of economic anxiety, right? And but one could also argue that American racism went subterranean after the Civil Rights Movement. It never really went away, right? It just wasn't nearly as visible. And I think as we moved into the 21st century, the rise of populism, the economic insecurity that I've been talking about, we've seen a reemergence of open white supremacy.
Okay. What about the popular misconception? What is the popular misconception about race, critical race theory?
Well, it's been used as a straw man by the forces of restriction, right? And I meant what I said when I said it was ancient in terms of academic theories at 46 years old or 45 years old. What it argues, in effect, is that you cannot divorce how we got to now from this country's tortured racial history. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of the misconceptions being perpetuated by media about what critical race theory is, and more importantly, what it is not. Some of the biggest misconceptions is that it's anti-white. It's not, by the way. It's just simply saying that this country's racial history, right, that there are no blank slates. It's impossible to separate this country's history from the late 20th century or the 21st century. Another is that it's predicated on white guilt. It's also not. That's also not true, right? It's simply saying that race has been embedded into the American legal system, and it's difficult to understand the American legal system without race.
As you were saying, the black codes back in the 17th.
That's right.
17th century,
On to the Jim Crow laws.
Jim Crow laws.
And beyond Jim Crow laws.
And
right?
beyond Jim Crow laws.
Absolutely.
And so it's embedded into our laws over a period of
Think of it
history.
this way, right? African Americans aren't fully fledged citizens of the United States until 1965, particularly Southern African Americans, with the ratification of the Voting Rights Act. That doesn't just emerge from culture or violence or terrorism or vigilantism. It is embedded into the legal system of the American South that African Americans cannot vote. The Commonwealth of Virginia passes a constitution in 1901 and 1902 during the convention. And those people who were responsible for convening that convention were very explicit that the convention was convened for the explicit cause of disenfranchising African Americans. That is a legal circumstance. In fact, with a swipe of the pen, with a signing of the pen, the Commonwealth effectively removes 80% of African Americans in 1901 and 1902 from the voting ranks. And the dirty little secret is it also removes 50% of whites. So what that means is, by law, the Commonwealth of Virginia had the lowest voter turnout of any southern state in the early 20th century and one of the lowest voter turnouts of any free democracy in the world.
Okay, so let's move on to say, what guidance would you give K-12 educators who want to teach critical race theory and anti-racism?
You don't see, I would say that there isn't really critical race theory in the classroom. This is a graduate school theory, right? I don't know where critical race theory, right? It's a lot of things. I gave you the condensed version, but it is, in effect, a high-level set of ideas, right, out of Harvard Law School. I'm not sure. What we have seen are elements of critical race theory being applied to the teaching of American history, which is quite simply, it is impossible to teach American history without race. It is a defining characteristic of who we are, and it defined the road that got us to now.
And I agree with you 100% because they're not teaching about the effect on slavery.
Right.
On African Americans
taught as a
and the
footnote.
whites.
It's taught as a footnote. Think of it as in the 17th, at certain points in the 18th century, black Africans made up over 40% of Virginia's population. How is that a footnote? Right? In 1850, a slave might have cost upwards of $40,000. The South, there were more assets in slaves in the South than in manufacturing or railroad construction. This is not a footnote. It was the driving engine for America's economic identity. So teaching about race isn't a pivot. It is essential to who we were and who we became. You can't separate one from the other. And I think doing so is a deeply disingenuous and ahistorical endeavor that is as much predicated in mythology as actual historical truth.
So what would you say about teaching the culture in the schools? And get away from it, put a label on it, critical race theory. What would you call it to teach our kids in there about, not our kids, but the Virginia State Education Department about teaching about race and slavery in school?
But how do you teach about Virginia history, in other words? It's not the only thing that defines Virginia, but it is a major defining characteristic of Virginia history. I think one of the things that we're really coming to terms with in the Commonwealth is the extent to which the lost cause has had a disproportionate influence on the teaching of American history in the Commonwealth of Virginia. That we are just coming to terms with teaching race in K through 12, given the centrality of African Americans to this Commonwealth's development is nothing short of appalling.
Okay. So how do we do that? I mean, I see these kids in school, the young people in school, they know nothing about their history. They know nothing about the fact that all they can see in there is a slave smiling and grinning and laughing, and the slave owner saying, yeah, they love it here. How do you get rid of that stereotype? And you're talking now to the Department of Education, because we should be talking to the Department of
What do
Education.
the historical documents say? Right? If we actually look at the past instead of mythologizing about it, the historical documents are staring us right in the face. And by the way, there have been any number of good historians right here in Charlottesville, down in the city of Richmond, all throughout the Commonwealth that have been talking about this racial history for decades. It's not as if the story hasn't been told. It's if the story is not trickling down. So I think what educators need to think about is how can we find the sources, right? What resources are there that will get us closer to a version of the historical truth that moves us beyond the manner in which Virginia's history had been taught for decades during the 20th century. And because there is no short supply of resources that we can use to get us closer to historical truth. And I think the further we move away from the mythologies, the idea that black folks were unprepared for freedom, the idea that the Civil War was fought over states' rights and not slavery. These are the kinds of ideas that for far too long have been central to the teaching of history in the Commonwealth of Virginia, despite the fact that the sources speak otherwise. I'll give you an example. Historian Ed Ayers and the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond digitized the Virginia secession hearing to vote whether or not Virginia was going to be a part of the Civil War on behalf of the Confederacy. We found at the University of Richmond that the word slavery came up hundreds of times, and the word states' rights only came up a handful of times. So if we actually dig into the past and we dig into the documents, rather than imagining what the documents say, I think the historical truth is easier to teach than we would like to think.
Okay, so let's we're about halfway through the program. I'm going to tell my audience, welcome to the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burruss, and our guest is Dr. Julian Hayter, and our topic is critical race theory. What do we do about it? Give me your version of, give me your insight and what we should be doing.
In terms of?
Of getting the Caucasians to agree that this is the way to go.
I have no idea, right? There's been so much resistance. Despite the fact, right, that the historical evidence points oftentimes to evidence that people would rather ignore. Racial reconciliation in terms of teaching the American story is not a zero-sum game. You can, on the one hand, say that African Americans have been essential, right, to American development. And for instance, let's take Monticello since we're in Charlottesville. For decades, Monticello would not deal with the issue of slavery. They referred to Thomas Jefferson as a farmer, right? Despite the fact that slave holding and being a slave owner was essential to Thomas Jefferson's legacy and the person that he was. You can, on the one hand, talk about Thomas Jefferson being a slave owner and his relations with the Hemings family, and talk about the fact that Thomas Jefferson was also essential to the founding of American democracy. Those types of complexities are what make history lively, what makes history real. And without that, I think we're doing the public a deep disservice. So to answer your question, a lot of times if you just deal with historians and historical actors on their own terms, the truth is usually staring you right in the face.
Okay,
Right.
So where do we start? I mean, there's so much animosity with white folks against this, what we call a critical race theory,
Sure.
or teaching black history in the schools.
Right. It's not black history. It's American history.
American history.
Right.
Exactly.
Right?
American
That's the first
history.
step, is to recognize that we are all implicated in the lives of others in this country. Right? That it's not white history. It's not black history. Slavery is not black history. It's American history. Jim Crow is not black history. It's American history.
So why do you think there's this animosity? So
Because I think because when we begin to talk about slavery, when we begin to talk about Jim Crow, we're dealing in the politics of empathy, and I think it makes certain people feel guilty, even though that's not the intent. Telling historical truth shouldn't make people be made to feel guilty. right?
Right.
I think people feel we've had no collective atonement over these things, and because we haven't had truth nor reconciliation over these issues, whenever we talk about them, it's like throwing Miracle Grow on our character flaws, right? People, in a shockingly predictable manner, run off into their respective camps. Oh, this is Black history. We shouldn't teach this, right? Oh, no, we've got to teach this. And I think what we need to do is find a moment or a space where we can tell this story in a community of trust that isn't about blame, right? But about historical truth.
Okay. You said something very interesting. You were saying that culture is embedded into our legal system.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Could you talk about redlining?
Sure.
And not only redlining, but the way the municipalities used to use zoning
Absolutely.
as a means of excluding African Americans from certain parts.
Yeah, by all
of town.
means. So slavery was codified during the slave era. During the Jim Crow era, we codify racial segregation. But Washington also plays a part in the segregating of United States life.
Washington being the federal government.
Washington being the federal government, right? So what we see in the 1930s is as the United States tries to resuscitate its economy, it does so by trying to build a culture of home ownership and doling out loans to people so that they can reinvest into American. I was like, before the 1930s, I think no more than 50% of people owned homes. There was no American home ownership culture, so to speak. So Washington comes in the 1930s with the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the FHA, and they federally insure and dole out mortgages. But the process is deeply exclusionary. People bring their biases to bear on these policies. So they create what are technically called residential security maps, and they're color-coded, to assess risk in particular neighborhoods where bankers and local lenders and the federal government should or should not invest money. White communities were almost always given what we call blue and green distinctions, meaning they were worthy of investment. Poor white communities and immigrant communities, generally yellow distinctions, which it was a risky investment, and red distinctions were almost always African American neighborhoods where the federal government discouraged bankers and local lenders from investing money. That process became known as redlining. What it meant is that African Americans very rarely got federally granted mortgages in these redlined areas. It's just systematic disinvestment is what it is. And when they did get mortgages in these areas, they were usually jacked up mortgage rates at deeply high interest levels. So over the course of the 20th century, we begin to see that this bankers' refusal to pump money into the culture of home ownership in the African American communities leads to systematic disinvestment. This then, of course, is made worse by urban renewal and freeway construction, which further devalues these enclaves. So by the 1960s and the 1970s, we begin to see, in effect, what we now know as the inner city, right? Because the federal government, through redlining, refused to invest in African American communities. And I mean, it is a wholesale endeavor. We're not talking about a city or two. We're talking about most cities with a sizable African American population had some form of redlining or other. So this is disinvestment on a national level.
And this is codifying.
It's done with recourse to the law, right?
Right.
Which, by the way, fits very comfortably in to what critical race theorists would say about how we got to now. It's impossible to separate what African Americans became, what communities became, from the politics of redlining. And because I think between 1933 and 1936, only 2% of mortgages granted by the HOLC and the FHA went to minority communities, right? Okay. And that number doesn't increase by much over the course of the mid-20th century. Even though there were African Americans, a sizable majority of them, who had the income to buy into home ownership, they were still disallowed simply because of race from engaging in this process.
Which is embedded into the law.
Oh, absolutely, because what we get in the suburbs is that most suburban communities, I think there was a point in the 1940s where 40% of the homes owned in American suburbs, which were almost exclusively white, were federally guaranteed mortgages. So in effect, the New Deal and federal policymakers with local lenders build the white middle class and with the suburban policy and systematically disinvest in African American communities in the quote unquote inner city.
Okay. So let's talk about how they use the justice system. Ronald Reagan came along. They used the justice system or the sentences to disenfranchise blacks and put them into prisons with longer periods.
You're talking about the war on drugs.
Right, the war on drugs.
Right. So we begin to see some really interesting rules. The hysteria of crack cocaine in the 1980s leads to some draconian laws that essentially build up the prison industrial complex that we're familiar with now. One are these disproportionate rules for punishment for crack cocaine, in large part because crack cocaine was perceived to be consumed by African Americans. So the laws begin to reflect that. Disproportionately high sentences for crack cocaine, which derives from cocaine, and disproportionately low sentences for cocaine. What that does in time, when it's accompanied by geographic policing, where police forces across the United States are systematically going into African American neighborhoods and arresting people for drug offenses, means that we see an explosion of individuals in the United States prisons. What we know now, strangely, is that I think that at one point, and I can't remember what year it was, there were 0 arrests for crack cocaine in the white community, despite the fact that we know, with recourse to the data, that whites consumed and distributed drugs at a higher rate than African Americans, but African Americans were disproportionately arrested for the same offenses. So the law is in effect used, much like Jim Crow laws were used to reorganize the black labor force in the late 19th century, to incarcerate African Americans at a higher clip than their white counterparts.
And this was done by Ronald Reagan started?
This is done by the Reagan administration. It's carried over by the Bush administration, but the Clinton administration also played a role in this. Absolutely. Yeah.
So what do we have to do as lay people, as citizens, to combat the notion that the laws, that culture is embedded into the laws? And that we need to do something about this policy.
I think a lot of people are just unfamiliar with this history, right? Because it's not taught particularly well. And I think you cannot have reconciliation without recognition. The first step in coming to terms with everything that we've been talking about over the last half an hour is recognizing that it exists, right? And ignorance is no excuse. And it is staring people right in the face, should they open up the historical material and look at it for what it is. And I think the first step, and because I'm a historian, I come up with historical solutions to contemporary problems, I think is to recognize that the history exists. And then I'll let the political scientists, the philosophers, the psychologists come up with the next phases. But we are, in effect, in the formative stages of trauma recovery. And I think the first stage of trauma recovery is recognizing there's a problem.
Okay. All right, we're getting ready to sum up. Could you just sum up and just leave something with our audience that you think they should really know about this issue?
Yeah, critical race theory has been used as a boogeyman to scare people off from not wanting to deal with many of the historical issues that continue to define who we are. And many of the things that have been perpetuated about critical race theory are simply not true. And if we would allow ourselves the opportunity to research this information, and instead of allowing people to interpret it for us, particularly talking heads on news stations, we would be a lot better off.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
This has been the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burruss. You can look at us on the website, neighborhoodlawcenter.com, or go to YouTube, youtube.com. I'm holding with me the book by Dr. Hayter, which is The Dream is Lost. I've read it. I encourage you to pick it up. You can go to Amazon, pick it up on Amazon and read it. Hopefully we can get enough copies that we can get it on audio. And so I just want to say one thing else is that I keep going back to education. And just to finish this up, what do we need to do to teach our children, as you're saying, American history, to get people away from this slave, black and white type of history? As a historian, as an educator, what do you think we should be doing? What should we be telling our...
We have to have a better conversation, and I think it starts with this. Our greatest strength is our greatest weakness. America's greatest strength is its diversity, but it's also our Achilles heel, right? Until we start to see across our distinctions and recognize, right, that there's something very unique happening in this country, where we can start to move beyond and recognize the historical wrongs of the past, and how those historical wrongs have, in some ways, defined how we got to now, we will not be able to move forward. We need to have a cathartic moment where this country heals. But one of the things I will say is one of the reasons we struggle with recognizing how much progress we have and have not made is because we're not being realistic about where we've been. And I think until we have collectively come together to recognize that we need a moment of healing, we are going to struggle.
Okay. Okay. I guess, what can we do with the state law? What is the status of the state law here in Virginia?
I have no idea, but I do know that there are people in the General Assembly who have historically been antithetical to the idea of teaching race. Maybe that's changing now, given the fact that the General Assembly is largely Democratic, but I do believe that it does, we need better textbooks, and we need legislators to recognize that if they're not invested in telling the historical truth, then the sins of the father will visit the children.
It continues.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, again, this is Melvin Burruss, your host. Our guest, Dr. Hayter, the Neighborhood Law Center. You can see us on the neighborhoodlawcenter.com or go to YouTube and just type in Neighborhood Law Center. And so next week, thanks for watching. Peace and God bless.